Alrighty, everyone. Welcome to our next lesson. This is lesson 7 on weather and climate. Lesson 7 on weather and climate. So in this lesson, we'll look at the differences between weather and climate, and we'll look at different types of climates. So first, we have to look at the difference between weather and climate. Please remember, split it. Weather is short-term things going on in the atmosphere. Short-term things going on in the atmosphere. For example, today, it's really usually pretty hot, but today is a nice 80-something degrees. Well, today that I'm recording this. However, tomorrow might be 90. And then the next day it might be 95. But then the next day it might go down to 76. And then the next day it might rain, or next day it might be sunny. These are short-term things that continue on as the years go by, as the days go by. Short-term, not long-term. Climate is the long-term relationship of the weather in a certain area. So weather is short-term, weather is short-term, climate is long-term. So we got a long-term situation going. That is the climate. And we'll look at different types of climates right now. First we got up is a tropical climate. Tropical climate. Tropical climates are predominantly near the equator. So the equator, remember that equator is a line that is right across the middle of the earth. So if you got places like Brazil in the Amazon rainforest, or you got the rainforest in Africa, or you got the rainforest in Southeast Asia, those are tropical climates. They're usually very humid, very wet, a lot of rainfall, a lot of vegetation, and usually very little dry seasons. So tropical climate, very wet, a lot of vegetation, a lot of plants, usually nearby the equator. Very, very moist area. So next we get is an arid climate. An arid climate. So the arid climate is pretty much the opposite of tropical. Arid is usually a desert type of climate. It's very dry, very little vegetation, very little moisture. So this includes like places like the Sahara Desert, the Gobi Desert, places like that. Arid usually means dry. So when you see arid, think of a dry desert place. A place where there's not a lot of vegetation, not a lot of water, very dry and not very moist ground. All right, so that's arid. Next, we'll get Mediterranean. Mediterranean. Now, Mediterranean, we'll look at this when we go over the different regions of the world. Mediterranean is that spot right in the middle of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's right where the Mediterranean Sea is located in. Now, Mediterranean, generally a kind of mild temperatured climate, not too crazy. But they have really hot summers. But then they have generally decent amount of vegetation, and they have some droughts, but it varies depending on how the atmosphere is going. So the climate is usually mild. These areas are usually places like Greece, Turkey, Israel, North Africa, France, Spain, Italy. Those kind of mild temperatured areas, but they have really blazing hot summers, but generally mild across the year. Next, we get temperate climates. So if we're looking at temperate climates usually they get a year-round seasons. So whenever you think of fall, spring, summer, and winter, these temperate climates are able to actually experience that. So usually in Texas, we usually it's either super hot and then mildly cold and then super hot again. So we don't really get a lot of seasons. But if you go more up north, like let's say like in Tennessee or like Kentucky or Virginia, they'll have things like seasons. They'll have summer where it's hot, and then they'll have winter where it's freezing cold. Then they'll have spring where it's nice and mild, and then they'll have fall where it's kind of cold but not too cold, kind of a temperature. So that's temperate. So medium temperatures. They get a decent amount of vegetation. They got a good amount of forest, usually deciduous forest. Those are nice, thick, foresty trees. So they generally do well when it comes to seasons. Next, we get continental. Continental is, think of a continent, and if you go in the interior of a continent, that is generally looking at a temperature that is mostly inside a certain large continent. They usually get hot summers and cold winters. Now, these continental climates vary drastically in every continent, but usually what it is super hot in the summer and then super cold in the winter. If you're thinking of places like Nebraska or Wyoming, those have continental climates. When it's the summer, it's pretty hot. When it's the winter, freezing cold. Generally a decent amount of vegetation and a good amount of plant life living there. Next, we get polar. Polar is the complete freezing of a region. Polar is usually affiliated with the two poles on our north and our southern poles. So our north and our southern poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, are considered polar. Now it's very cold and it is very dry. It's a dry cold. So not a lot of precipitation when it comes to polar, and not a lot of vegetation. Very few animals live in the polar spheres. If they do, they have really thick furs or really thick skin, or they have a certain type of way of controlling the temperature of their bodies, so they're able to manage the cold spots. These places have very little access to sunlight because they're on the different poles. The two poles, the North and the South Pole, have very little access to sunlight. So that makes it difficult for any kind of heat to get anywhere. So it's freezing cold in these areas, very little vegetation. Next is mountainous. So in the mountainous areas, we see that the situation is mostly dealing with large mountains. Now, mountains, it gets very interesting because mountainous climates kind of have to deal with the higher you go in elevation, the colder the temperature gets. Higher elevation, colder temperature gets. And then they have different types of precipitation the higher you go. Because when a cloud comes up to a mountain, there, and then for a cloud to go over that mountain, it has to release the water for it to go over that mountain. So once it releases that water, rain falls, and then the cloud is able to go over the mountain. So if a cloud wants to go over a mountain, it has to release a lot of rain. That rain creates a nice certain type of vegetation for the area, and then that vegetation then produces a nice ecosystem. Then we get to our last one, oceanic. Oceanic kind of is mostly a climate associated or closely connected to the coastline. So oceanic, there's a lot of rainfall because I mean it's the ocean. The clouds go over the ocean, accumulate a lot of water, and then as soon as they reach or get close to land, they drop that rainfall. So a lot of rainfall near there. Usually mild temperatures. You ever been to a beach? A beach is usually nice. Nice temperatures, not too cold, not too hot, usually a decent climate. Alrighty, guys, now that is it for our section on climate. I'll see you next time.